Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Institute for Personal Development, Kriya Yoga Ashram, where total consciousness is the new frontier.
Kriya Yoga is union of the individual with the divine. Join us as we explore the practices to initiate this process.
Good morning. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. Let's Talk Consciousness. I am your hostess, Lisa Winton, and with me is Kenny Toy, also known as Swami Jayananda, founder of the Institute for Personal Development, located here in Hampton, New Hampshire. Good morning, Swami. Thank you for being here today. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing pretty good today. How about you?
I'm doing pretty good today, too. Thanks for asking. And we want to thank you all for tuning in. So today on the Voice of Yoga, we have dedicated 12 shows to discussing the 12 signs of the Zodiac as a map leading to spiritual understanding. Each week focuses on the respective sign as an archetype used in the process of an individual becoming divine. Listen this week as we explain the function of Gemini, based on the simple observation, how we think is what we become. These shows will explore why divine law cannot function in your experience if you are not conscious of its presence. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. We are talking consciousness. Join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance to get the light in your soul and experience divine mind. So, Swami, this is part 3, which should be Gemini. So what can you tell us about Gemini?
Yeah, Gemini, the key phrase for Gemini is, I think. And a big part of the teaching that we have been doing here has focused on the simple statement that how we think is what we become. And Gemini now becomes the first of the mutable signs and the first mode of thinking that we experience. I think maybe what we might want to try and talk a little bit about is, in astrology, they use what's called quadruplicities and triplicities. And the quadruplicities break down into cardinal, fixed, and mutable signs. And so for each of the mutable signs, you have the other signs that fall in that same element. The quadruplicities for Aries would be Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. For Taurus would be Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn. And for Gemini, you would have Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius. And for Cancer, you would have Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces. And so that would be how you would break down things according to the modality of the sign. And then the triplicities break down into cardinal, fixed, and mutable. So in other words, the cardinal signs would be Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. That would be the cardinal signs of the Zodiac. And then the fixed signs would be Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius. And the mutable signs would be Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces. And so when you're breaking down the Zodiac in such a way, you kind of see the relativity of how things are interconnected. And what we're trying to do in these shows here is trying to use the Zodiac kind of like as a template or a map for the unfoldment of individual consciousness, going from a personal sense of I into an impersonal spiritual sense of selfhood. And a big part of this whole process is how we think. And Gemini, being the first sign that introduces how we think, is a good place to start.
Now, so let's talk about how we think. How can we use Gemini to assist us in how we think? How should we be thinking differently?
Well, what I'm starting to learn is to learn just the different modes that we think with. In her book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, Mary Baker Eddy mentions that there are 3 modes of mortal thought. And as you start to understand what she's talking about, Gemini, which is referred to in this model as the lower mind. And a big part of how we originally start to think is how we start to develop a sense of who we are. And we start with our first signs of awareness really come from acknowledging identity bound up in a physical body. So instinct, appetite, preservation, and survival becomes our original mode of thought. We basically move towards what we want. We move away from what we don't want. And we are starting to develop a sense of awareness of sensual perception. But what we didn't, or what I didn't know from the onset is that this is the veil. This is what prevents us from seeing who we really are. And so the more we accept and identify with this body awareness, this mortal means of thinking, the more bound up we are in the laws that are associated with that limited sense of identity.
Swami, we've been talking a lot in these shows about needs and desires and wants. So what does that have to do with Gemini?
Yeah, Gemini is our introduction into our first mode of mortal thought. And it really is, it's all about need. But it's need based on identity bound up in a corporeal physical body that appears to have needs. And that's one of the things that we always talked about in Kriya Yoga and in the teaching that we did, is the difference between a need and a want. But in this model, we're actually moving beyond physical need into spiritual identity. And so one of the things that I didn't realize was just what a barrier that was to moving beyond physical identity. In order to get out from under the jurisdiction of karmic law and to experience the benefits of spiritual law, you really have to understand that we are not a physical body. And if we assume identity and we then become under the rulership of preservation and survival and instinct and appetite, then we are reactive and emotional, and we react to the testimony of our 5 senses. Now, what this does is it creates a huge barrier to experiencing the 5th stage of yoga, which is pratyahara, sense withdrawal. And you can't give up sense awareness if you identify with a physical body, because like attracts like. So we really have to change our identity. But if you understand how this whole thing works, then it becomes an easier task to accomplish than if you don't understand how this is really working and why I must do what it is that is being suggested here.
Swami, what would you consider to be the essential needs?
Yeah, well, what we used to say was based on their order of importance, that your priorities should really be based on how long can I live without something. Because a lot of us think food is an essential need. And for most of us with material identity, it becomes provable. And you can live weeks without food, but you can live days without water. You can live minutes without air. But we can't live a millisecond without the presence of spirit. Spirit is the truth of our being. But spirit is our identity. And what's interesting about that is that when you identify with spirit, you no longer have these essential needs. And in fact, the reason you no longer have it is because you identify then with the allness of the creative principle of the divine law of life.
So if we're having this need for food or water, whatever, that's pulling us back into the mortal belief that we are just human.
Well, yeah, it's the identity with what is provisional and temporal. The physical body, the appearance of a physical body is provisional, but it's not who I am. So as you start to understand yourself based on this progression of zodiacal signs, and even as we move into the process of apotheosis, we are going from physical identity to mental identity to eventually spiritual identity. With each progression, things start to change dramatically. And the benefits that come with these changes will inspire you and encourage you and also motivate you to continue with this progression.
Swami, I had a thought upon waking this morning, and that thought was when we say, well, we're only human, or I'm only human. So my first thought was that gives us the excuse to continue to making mistakes, but then I think we can really drill down on that statement. I kind of want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think in our progression that, like we have been saying in most of these shows, everything is going to be contingent upon what it is that we are attracted to. Because even to say that I'm only human, there are those of us that are emotional, reactive, and controlled by the instincts and appetites of our bodies, which means that we're really no better than an animal. That to be human means that you're intelligent, that you are working with your mental functions. Like you're saying, I mean, a lot of us have these cliche responses to things that kind of justify us for being where we are. And they're really not what I would call wisdom, information that could lead to the truth of your being. To accept the simple fact that, or the statement that I grew up with was to err was human. To forgive was divine. And we assume that by accepting human identity, now all of my errors are excusable. Whereas the Bible tells us to be perfect like your Father. And that should really be what we're striving for, is this perfection of being. But without good leadership, most of the stuff that I'm learning now isn't something I grew up with this information. It's not something we talked about at the dinner table when I was growing up. And so it's new information, and it's learning the depth and meaning and the experiences that are associated with the terms that really help us understand what is human potential, what is this thing called enlightenment, what is total consciousness, because these are real experiences and they're not just cliche statements that we make and continue to live out of our own ignorance of our hidden potential.
Well, I think this is a good place to pause to hear a word from our sponsor. So listeners, we'll be back with you in just a few moments. Kriya Yoga Theory 1, Human Development and the 8 Essential Stages of Kriya Yoga. This program is a comprehensive course that will help you get your arms around the science of Kriya Yoga. It provides a clear understanding of the goals and objectives behind yoga, along with the physics of spirituality. It includes the practices, supportive concepts of Kriya Yoga, and the process in human development, apotheosis, the process of the human becoming divine. A complete guide on how to become a human in the adult state. Get the light in your soul and experience the simplicity and joy of union with the divine. This course is available in live classes at the ashram or online with 8 videos or 4 CDs. Visit our website, www.ipdtransform.com, for more information. Welcome back. For those of you just joining us, you're listening to The Voice of Yoga, and we are talking consciousness. So, Swami, it looks like on our notes we have left to talk about is Gemini as it relates to The Labors of Hercules by Alice Bailey. So why don't we get started on that?
Yeah, in Alice Bailey's book, The Labors of Hercules, the labor that is associated with Gemini are the golden apples of Hesperides, Part 1 and Part 2. And the thing that I really find really helpful about this labor is that there are 5 steps to this labor, and it's mostly about service. Now, the introduction of the 5 steps really is starting to build the understanding of the 5-sense mind, which becomes the origins of mortal thought. What most of us do not understand is that the testimony of our 5 senses is really the sin that they're talking about in the Bible. And for us to have allegiance to the 5 senses, as opposed to piercing through the senses and perceiving the truth of being, which is really the perfection of being, which is God's creation, is really a violation to spiritual law. In this labor, if you really start to drill down with it and you look at these 5 steps that she mentions in it, you can really start to see how we must overcome mortal thought and to reject the testimony of our senses. And it's 180 degrees from the way most of us think. And me personally, I was raised on Murphy's Law, that what can go wrong will go wrong, and at the worst possible time. Any TV commercial that you see that has any kind of medical message to it is really about early detection, to believe the testimony of your senses. We're constantly looking for our clues in the material, but in the wrong way. That to really understand spirit is cause, as opposed to matter having any say in the revelation of creation, is a sin. It misses the mark. As you start to maybe revisit these zodiacal signs and you start to look at Gemini in a completely different way, that you use the testimony of your senses just as a barometer to give you an understanding of, well, how am I thinking? And then as we progress in these shows, but also in previous shows, we've really talked about the 3 modes of mortal thought and how to think with divine mind. Because divine mind is the one mind of this universe, that there really is only one mind, there's only one life, there's only one truth, and there's only one spirit, and that spirit animates all creation. But if we sow to the testimony of our senses, the Bible calls that sowing to the flesh. And if we accept that, then we are in what they called sin. And it's really not the old theology of conduct that we were socialized with, to believe that by being a good human, you become spiritual. It doesn't work that way.
So that's the challenging part, I would say, would be to recognize those belief systems that we've kind of been bombarded with, and then try to work past them or overcome them into this, let's say, this new way of thinking, which really isn't new at all.
Right. And it's moving from thinking with a five-sense human mind and being controlled by an identity that is bound up in a mortal body and having a belief in mortality, period, and starting to shift your identity to a part of yourself that is eternal, that always was, that always will be. And then to trust in what is invisible and intangible as opposed to the testimony of your five-sense mind.
You had said earlier that the 5 steps to the labor of Hercules was mostly about service. But then again, we just made a statement that it's really not about our good deeds that gets us to heaven. So how do we have this balance, and what do we mean by service?
Well, everything is going to come down to the exchange of energy. If you are about taking, forgetting, and I really like that term, forgetting, and then you look at maybe a lot of the symptoms or conditions today are really about people losing their memory. And that really implies that you're drawing off of a resource of energy that is limited. In order to be forgiving, that you really are drawing from a resource of energy that doesn't become exhausted. It's inexhaustible. It's eternal. It's unchanging. And so by changing the exchange of energy from getting to giving, it really starts to change the deeper understanding of the word service. Because in Kriya Yoga, we really talk about selfless service. Once you move beyond a personal sense of self and personal identity, you no longer are getting, but you really start to give. And one of the main motivators for giving is that what you're putting out is what you're getting back. It's really the most selfish thing that you can do is service. Because again, what you're putting out is what you're getting back. You're doing unto yourself, but not the limited personal sense of self, but the universal sense of I, that I am, and the same soul that's animating you is animating me, and what I do unto you, I do unto myself. When you are at that level of understanding, then service is really the most natural thing that you could do, because you have a divine nature, as opposed to a personal sense of I that is doing something for someone else in order to get something for themselves.
Mm-hmm. You reminded me, when I was a younger girl, I joined the Order of Rainbow for Girls, and one of the stations of the bow, there were 7 stations that made up the bow stations, and each one represented a color of the rainbow. And then there was an attribute that was assigned to each of those colors, to the bow stations. And the very last one was called service. And we had to learn the lectures of what that bow station meant. And throughout our time in Rainbow, we would try to exemplify those stations of the rainbow, especially the service. And as a child, we didn't really want to head out and do these things. We would go to the convalescent homes and things like that, and it was more of a chore for us. And so now, thinking about service, I think of it at a totally different light.
Right. You're moving away from that conduct-based motivation and the reward-based motivation that most of us have been socialized with, that old theology. If you're a good human, that you will be rewarded from the divine. But it doesn't really work that way. If you're a good human, that is what you will remain, as a good human. But in order to accept spiritual identity, you have to give up humanhood. You have to give up all of the limitations that come with a personal sense of I, and then accept this impersonal sense of spiritual selfhood.
So I have a question for you. Let's talk more about Gemini and the constellations of Gemini.
Yeah, that just to be consistent with what we have started out with Aries and Taurus. Gemini, in Alice Bailey's book, the constellations that she associates with Gemini or included in the zodiacal sign of Gemini is Lupus, which is the hare, Canis Major, the greater dog, and Canis Minor, which is the lesser dog.
And do they have a significance that we should learn something from each one of those?
Well, I think personally for me, the hare, which in Native American totems, the rabbit is really the symbol for fear and the message of fear. The more that we start to drill down with the concept of fear, and again comes back to need, is that you're going to find that all fear originates with a personal sense of I. That if there was no personal sense of I that was threatened or had the possibility of annihilation or a belief in mortality, that we're going to die, there would be no fear. The symbol of the dog for me has always been man's best friend. So friendship, whether major or minor, the level of relationship. And again, the more that we can start to see that the same soul that animates you animates me, then we're not as judgmental, we're not as selective about who it is that we're going to associate with, because we start to identify away from the appearance of the five sense testimony that is before you, and you start to live from the truth of being, which is found in spiritual identity.
Swami, so this is some really great information you've given us. So how do we take this information and actually start applying it into our daily lives?
Well, what I've started to do is just stay with the original formula. How I think is what I become, but then starting to understand how I am thinking. And now having the understanding that what I thought thinking was before has now expanded into something much more extensive and detailed. And so moving away from needs, wants, and even a sense of purpose in my modes of thinking, because they're all mortal and they're all based on the testimony of a five sense mind. And starting to understand how to think, and I love what Mary Baker Eddy had said, to think with God as God, to actually let divine mind take over the scientific government of your being, because that's more in compliance with Scripture, the wisdom of Scripture. As you start to let go of your personal ambitions, your personal needs, your personal desires, and you start to attune yourself to the will of the Father, and you start to let divine mind, which holds the template for perfect creation, make your decisions for you, you're now living by grace. And you're under the jurisdiction of divine law, which is optimal. That's basically what I've started to do, is just educate myself and understand that there is such a thing as thinking wrong and start to think right.
And so with that, I guess we'll start closing down our show for today. Listeners, be sure to visit our websites, www.ipdtransform.com. And once you're there are a lot of tools on that website that you can further your spiritual development and continue your learning experiences. And don't forget, Swami also has a free webinar that you can access from the website as well, and that's Wednesdays at noon. And also be sure to look for our Wednesdays Facebook Live episodes that air at 5 o'clock. So, Swami, any other final thoughts about today's program?
Well, I would like to encourage people to repent And I really like the interpretation of that term, which means to think differently, to start letting go of the five senses and start to think with divine mind. And with that, I'll wish everybody a good day. Namaste.
Thank you for listening to our program, The Voice of Yoga. This is Lisa Winton, along with Swami Jayananda. We'll be signing off. Have a wonderful Kriya Yoga kind of day. Namaste.